Hello, good morning and welcome. At the last count last night, there were around a little less than 1,400 participants, with Rafael, our participant and speaker from Venezuela, and then from Ireland, Pakistan, India, New Zealand, and of course, Australia. Buenas noches, Rafael, y bienvenido, aunque sea virtualmente, a Australia.
Gracias, Mario.
My name is Mario Trinidad, and I am a member of the South Australian Catholics for an Evolving Church, SYNODAL. Let us begin with an acknowledgement of country. We begin this morning by acknowledging all First Peoples of this vast continent and celebrate their enduring connections to country, knowledge, and stories. We pay our respects to elders and ancestors who watch over us and guide Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community.
Recording in progress.
We extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are present with us today. We recognize that First Nation sovereignty was never ceded. This continent was, is, and always will be First Nations. Our format this morning is simple. After an opening prayer on reflection in silence, Trish Hindmarsh of the Concerned Catholics of Tasmania will introduce Rafael Luciani. Rafael will then address us. During Rafael's talk, the chat box is open, but will not be visible to participants. Please write your comments and questions on the chat box. Kevin Liston of SEIKE and co-chair of ACCCR, Australian Catholic Coalition for Church Reform, and Andrea and David will be monitoring it. When Rafael finishes his talk, Kevin will give a summary of the comments and pose the questions to Rafael. You may still continue to pose your questions even when the question time has begun. The question time will run for 30 to 45 minutes. Andrea Dean of WATAP, Women in the Australian Church, will end with a summary and thanks. The webinar runs for an hour and a half. Rafael has given us kindly an electronic copy of his latest article on synodality. It will be made available to all participants. Participants may also buy from Garrett Publishers 2 of Rafael's books, Synodality, A New Way of Proceeding in the Church, and Pope Francis on the Theology of the People. In silence, we now pray that we may be open to the Spirit and to one another as we seek to build a new way of being church. And while you're praying, I encourage you to read also these 2 excerpts from works of Rafael. Over to you, Trish.
Good morning, everyone. I come to you this morning from the lands of the Palawa people of Lutruwita, Tasmania. Our guest today, theologian Rafael Luciani, commented on the synodal process when it was officially launched by Pope Francis in 2021, describing it as the most important event since Vatican Council II. Why? Because it calls us afresh to reinterpret and live out the Council's radical ecclesiology of the people of God. In Raphael's words, synodality is no less than a new model of church, bishops listening to the people of God as members of the people of God. Professor Rafael Luciani is a lay Venezuelan theologian, an expert advisor for SYNODAL, the Latin American Bishops' Council. He holds professorships at both Catholic University Andrés Bello in Venezuela and at Boston College. We might recall that Pope Francis was himself greatly influenced by SYNODAL. He brought to Rome fresh theological thinking and pastoral experience from the Fifth SYNODAL Aparecida Conference of 2007, not to mention his work among the dwellers of the favelas in his own capital city. That fresh thinking and the See Judge Act methodology have significantly shaped Francis's great encyclicals, as well as inspiring his pastoral approach as Pope and his commitment to collegiality. Rafael Luciani is a member of the Theological Preparatory Commission for the 2023-24 Synod. This commission is one of the 4 that were formed to advise the Synod General Secretariat in the lead up to the Synod. Australian theologian Ormond Rush is also a member of the Theological Commission. Susan Pascoe is a member of the Methodological Commission. Anthony Fisher, a member of the Ordinary Commission of Elected Bishops. We have no Australian representative among the 17 members of the 4th Commission, the Spirituality Commission. These advisory bodies have collaborated with Synod General Secretary Cardinal Grech and the Undersecretaries Bishop Louis Marin and Sister Natalie Beckhardt. The General Secretariat of the Synod has just finalised the Instrumentum Laboris, titled For a Synodal Church, Communion, Participation and Mission. That will form the agenda for the Synod and is a culmination of global consultation across the 6 continents and within each of their member countries. The methodology for the conduct of the Synod proposed by the Methodology Commission has also been approved. We look to the Latin American countries for particular emphasis on moving to the peripheries. Australian Bishop of the Sandhurst Diocese, Shane McGinlay, will be one of the Episcopal delegates from the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference to attend the Synod. Shane chaired sessions at the recent Australian Plenary Council and attended the German Synod in recent weeks as an invited guest. He described today's webinar as an excellent initiative and sent the following message. I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Luciani to Australia virtually, and I'm sorry I'm not able to join this webinar in person. In his many roles, Rafael has generously helped us grow in our insights into synodality and the great opportunities that are open for us by committing to this way of being church. I encourage all those present to continue to participate in the opportunities that we have to become more synodal, both in preparation for the First Assembly of the Universal Synod and in the way we live our mission in our dioceses, parishes and agencies. End of message. As Catholics committed to the conversion and reform of our church, we warmly welcome you, Rafael. You are online with us today in Australia and across the continent of Oceania and as far as Europe and beyond. We look forward greatly to sharing your wisdom, your insight regarding today's topic, walking together towards synodal conversion. Thank you, Rafael.
Thank you so much, Patricia, Mario, Kevin, Andrea, all that have made possible this moment. And most of all, I want to share with you 4 points that can help us to reflect and discern on this way of being church, a church as people of God. No? A first point will be situating ourselves as people of God. A second will be living and walking together as people of God. A third one, a co-responsible and participatory institutional model. And a last one will be listening as a mediation through which we listen to the Spirit. First point is situating ourselves as people of God. What we understand today by synodality is the fruit of the great ecclesiological shift promoted by the Second Vatican Council from the incorporation of the category people of God that, as the International Theological Commission says, highlights the common dignity and mission of all baptized in the exercise of the multiform and order richness of their charisms, their vocations, and their ministries. The notion of people of God had been proposed by Cardinal Suenens during the Second Vatican Council, who added a chapter entitled De Populo Dei to the Schema de Ecclesia. This change will be then incorporated in the Textus Emendatus by placing the chapter on the people of God before the other chapter dedicated to the hierarchy. That is, the chapter 2, people of God, before chapter 3 on the hierarchy. With this new sequence, the Council Fathers chose to recognize the radical equality of all the members of the people of God by reason of their baptismal dignity, and emphasized that as the International Theological Commission says, the ecclesiastical hierarchy is placed at the service of the people of God. Is placed at the service of the people of God. Therefore, Vatican II chose to distinguish between what is permanent, which lies in the unique Christian vocation, and the transitory or temporary, which corresponds to the functions, the roles, the services to carry out the mission of the Church in the world. If Congar maintained, and I quote, that a horizontal decentering of the community and the people of God had been achieved during the council, which means that the people of God is structured by a hierarchy whose functional character is manifested in its nature of service to the evangelizing mission of the Church, rather to its own self-preservation, which is always the temptation as a church. This mind of the conciliar text posed the challenge of putting into practice a new hermeneutic inspired by the Church as an organic totality of the faithful, in whose reciprocal interaction they are constituted as the people of God. Cardinal Suenens emphasized this novelty when he said, and I quote, "If I were asked, what is the richest germ of life in pastoral consequences due to the council, I would answer without hesitation, the rediscovery of the people of God as a whole, as a totality, and consequently the co-responsibility that derive from this for each of its members." This is Cardinal Suenens, the architect of Lumen Gentium, that responded this after the council. The great discovery of being a church people of God and the co-responsibility, as he says, that derive from that model of church. A second point, if we are church of people of God, then we are called to live and to walk together. In light of this, Pope Francis describes the institutional form of a synodal church with the following words that we all have heard many times. What the Lord asks of us, in a certain sense, is already contained in the word synod, to walk together, laity, pastors, Bishop of Rome. But what does this expression means? This expression walking together that we repeat continuously. The document of the International Theological Commission on Synodality in the Life and the Mission of the Church explains the scope of this expression, walking together, by defining synodality as a constitutive dimension of the whole church. And it says that it refers to the specific way of living and operating and acting of the church people of God, which manifests and concretely realizes its being communion in walking together in the common life and mission of the church. And the same document says that this is realized specifically, and I quote, by gathering in assembly, and in the active participation of all its members in its evangelizing mission. Consequently, a synodal church supposes meeting and discerning together in order to put into actions modalities and decision-making processes that arise from the participation of all, a great responsibility. Moreover, walking together implies the fact that any process of reform in the church must seek ways to involve the entire people of God in its totality and not some. And the totality involved in the processes of discernment, of elaboration, decision-making, decision-taking in the church. Or, as again the International Commission says, the synodal dimension of the church must be expressed through the realization and the governance on processes of participation and discernment, capable of manifesting the dynamism of the communion that inspires all ecclesial decisions. This is really important because it's a call to the church to integrate, to involve all faithful, all members of the church in all that has to do with the life and with the mission of the church. And this is a call to articulate the participation of all according to the vocation of each one of us in the church. A third aspect that derives from the first two that I have shared, a co-responsible and participatory institutional model. So if we have synodality as the essence, as the modus operandi, what characterizes the church, then we may ask ourselves, how is this institutionalized and not simply lived in the spirit of all of us as faithfuls? So in light of what have been mentioned above, we can affirm, as it is stated again by the Theological Commission, that, quoting, we are all co-responsible. We are all co-responsible for the life and the mission of the community, and we are called to act according to the law of mutual solidarity in respect for the specific ministries, charisms, and inasmuch as each receives its energy from one Lord. This is based on the fact that we, all faithful, are enabled by reason of baptism of the gift of the Holy Spirit. And therefore, there is a reciprocity among all of us, inter fideles, among all the faithful, that is not something auxiliary or external, but it is something that defines the essence of the church. In Lumen Gentium 32, it says very clearly that each member is at the service of the other members, so that pastors and other members of the faithful are bound to one another by mutual necessity. A beautiful expression that is telling us that our relationships in the church are not auxiliary, just to help one another. They are relationships that are mutually needed, and therefore they become links and bonds among all the faithful, defining each one of us in our own vocations, services, gifts, and ministries. Therefore, we can sustain, as the International Theological Commission maintains, that the concept of synodality refers to the co-responsibility and the participation of the whole people of God, not of some. Though, while it is true that co-responsibility expresses the active subject character of all baptized, participation supposes the necessary complementarity based on what each one can contribute: laity, religious life, presbyterate, episcopate. Considering, this is important, considering one's own gift, charisms, services, ministries. But participation needs to be institutionalized. It's not simply a good spirit or a good will. It needs to be institutionalized. It is opportune here to recall the words of Pope Francis in his letter to all the people of God in Chile, when he wrote to the people of God, not only to the bishops, to the people of God in Chile. In that letter, he says, I invite all diocesan organizations, whatever the area, to seek consciously and lucidly spaces of communion and participation, so that the anointing of the people of God may find its concrete means to manifest. This is a prophetic call that Francis is offering, that every diocese, every structure in the church should give space and turn itself into a mediation of the anointment of the people of God that should manifest in each of our ecclesial structures. But how can this participation be enabled and practiced in an institutional model capable to shape the whole life of the church at all levels? How can this be institutionalized? We can mention at least three aspects that need to be taken into account. First, as it is offered by the Theological Commission in this document that I always recommend to read on synodality in the life and the mission of the church, it says first, the whole community, not part of the community, in the free and the rich diversity of its members, not of some of its members, must be called together. So this is the first element in order to have a authentic participation. The whole community should be called, not some part of the community. And we should recognize the free and the rich diversity of its members. A second element is participation in ecclesial processes is activated by communicative dynamics. This is a beautiful expression that may help us to understand what we are living, communicative dynamics. These are, for example, praying, listening, analyzing, dialoguing, advising, discerning. These dynamics have the purpose, the scope to create an interaction among all the faithful that generates a process of conversion and a process of comprehending the other's position and becoming engaged in a dialogue. A third element is that the purpose is not only to know each other much better and share experiences, is to take pastoral decisions together. And this document of the International Theological Commission says at the end, in conformity with God's will. That means that the whole community being convoked and living these dynamics is a mediation to know God's wills today. And this is a huge responsibility for pastors and the rest of the faithful in the church. In this model, the last word can never be taken in isolation by some or by one, but must arrive from the experience of walking together, enabling a new culture, a culture of consensus building, a culture of consensus building in which all the faithful take part, each one according to its own vocation and its own contribution. So this new culture that we are called to create in the church of consensus building may be a light that can illuminate our way towards a new institutional model. The last point is how listening becomes today a mediation through which we listen to the Spirit. By listening the other, we listen to the Spirit. What Gaudium et Spes in the Council have taught us, that we find God through history, in the events, in the life, in the experiences of the other. So by listening, we can say that we find also that voice of the Spirit that is calling us to convert and to reform today. From this horizon, it is possible to build the ecclesial we, not an ecclesial I, an ecclesial we, through the implementation of a series of communicative dynamics. As I have said before, these communicative dynamics can be consulting, listening, dialoguing, discerning in common, taking advice, elaborating decisions together, being accountable. These are all communicative dynamics. One challenge lies in its inclusive character, as expressed in the document for the continental stage of the Synod on Synodality, when it says, and I quote, that listening requires that we recognize the others as subjects of their own journey. When we do so, says the document, others feel welcome and not judged, free to share their own spiritual journey. The synodal experience can be read as a path of recognition for those who do not feel sufficiently recognized in the church. With these beautiful words of the document, we can say that listening to others is a powerful communicative dynamic that opens the way to conversion and overcomes an ecclesial self-referential model. In fact, people consulted during the continental stage of the Synod on Synodality said, and I again quote the document, not listening leads to misunderstanding, to an exclusion, to marginalization. As a further consequence, it creates close-mindedness, simplification, lack of trust, and fears that destroy the community. Without listening, says the document, the responses to the difficulties of the faithful are taken out of context and do not address the essence of the problems they experience, becoming empty moralism. Therefore, we can say that the great novelty of these communicative dynamics lie in the fact that they give form to a new way of being and of building church, that is, to a permanent ecclesial way of proceeding that situates in a practical and in experiential way the hermeneutics that I refer at the beginning, where chapter 2 becomes the criterion to interpret the rest of the chapters of Lumen Gentium. That means that people of God, chapter 2, is the central hermeneutical criterion to interpret chapter 3 on the hierarchy, chapter 4 on the laity, chapter 6 on religious life. And in this way, these dynamics activate in an organic way and link us together as ecclesial subjects, one another, by means of reciprocal actions, because we are all exercising in a communal, in a communitarian way, these acts of listening, consulting, and dialoguing. In fact, Pope Francis uses these communicative dynamics to define the model of the church as a constitutive synodal church. In the address that we have all read during the commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the institution of the Synod of Bishops, the Pope said that a synodal church is a church of listening, and he adds immediately, it is a reciprocal listening, not simply listening, a reciprocal listening in which everyone has to learn. If someone doesn't learn of listening, it is not an authentic listening. So you have listening, you have a reciprocal listening, and then he adds, each one has something to learn. So to end, we can say that the need of a synodal church needs also mediations through which we listen to the Spirit. And if we believe that the Spirit manifests freely through all the persons and their life stories, even in the points of view that are completely different and diverse from our own. The latter is also a mediation of the Spirit that we often forget because it can be uncomfortable to listen, to talk, and to discern in common. Hence, the art of listening requires formation and experience, and to provide the necessary means at our disposal. I would like to end with a paragraph taken from a speech that Pope Francis gave before the opening of the Synod, where he challenged us by saying that synodality is not a chapter in a treatise on ecclesiology. It's not a chapter. It even less a slogan. It's not a slogan. It is not a new term to be used or manipulated in our meetings. And Francis finishes saying synodality expresses the nature of the church, its form, its style, its mission. We speak of a synodal church, avoiding considering it as one title among others. It is the challenge that we have ahead to build altogether a new institutional model that will enable a synodal church for the third millennium. Thank you.
Thank you, Rafael. That has been fantastic, and it's tremendous to hear the encouragement that you give us. You've touched on a range of issues that do concern us all. Questions from the audience today are solid and substantial. I'd like to begin with one that is coming from Peter Johnston. Where are we now? Yes, it says, Rafael, you have referred to the clerical institutional model of our church. We have an institutional church run by male clerics who commonly accept their autocratic authority as fundamental to their roles. Is it not inevitable that this clericalist culture will reject true synodality, the radical equality of the people of God, as the antithesis of the clerical model? This is already happening in some major dioceses in Australia. Can the Synod on Synodality break through this clericalist culture?
I think that's the challenge because we have inherited, it's a culture, a clericalist culture, and a culture is something that permeates all our life in the way we live, in the way we interact, in the way we think and discern. So the challenge is how do we convert this current clerical culture into a synodal culture. In my own view, it will take perhaps a generation, but if we do not start in, for example, catechesis, where we begin to form ourselves in the faith, this culture of a synodal church will be more difficult. If we don't start also in seminaries, then the next priests for the next 15, 20 years will not be also formed in this new culture. And if we don't take into account parishes and the way in which we understand parishes, it will be also difficult. So I think the challenges around formation and institutions such as seminaries and parishes are key in order to have this change from an clericalist to a synodal culture.
Okay, thanks very much. The question that is often put to people that the formation of the clergy is the root cause of the clericalist attitude. There's an alternative view, excuse me, that it's the lifestyle that priests have after, or parish clergy particularly, have after ordination that contributes to that clericalist attitudes. What's your view?
Yes, in fact, something that has been very helpful to understand clericalism is a report that was done in Australia and by the Royal Commission. And one of the points there is precisely that, how ordination in the consciousness of a seminarian sometimes becomes like a step forward in their mind and to make the person even in a higher degree or feeling with much authority in regards to the other. So we have said this in many groups, we have to rethink theology of ministries. And it's not to change the ordained ministry, it's to make a church of ministries that is not limited to the ordained ministers. So I think rebalancing what means to be a minister and a theology of ministry could help to change this way of seeing ordination linked to a ministry, and therefore I become someone superior or with more knowledge or with more authority than the others. So it's also a matter then of rebalancing ministries by a theology or renewed theology of ministries.
Thanks, Rafael. Jacinta Bright is asking, can you define all the faithful in relation to all the people of God? Are people who have left the church considered to be amongst the faithful? Often people who have left the church are seen as lacking knowledge, understanding, and therefore insight.
Yeah, this is a beautiful expression that throughout the years we have misunderstood it because it was sometimes limited or seen as something that was applied to the lay people. And in fact, sometimes when we are in a Eucharist and the priest is saying something, we hear expressions like the faithful, the others, the faithful thing, or the others, but not I as a priest are also a faithful. So the expression is a beautiful one because for the council, it was an expression of the identity of each baptized in the church to give the same rights and the same duties. And we can remember that Pope Francis, the first time he used the expression walking together in his first blessing in St. Peter, he said, the Pope is a faithful, the Bishop is a faithful, the Presbyter is a faithful, the lay is a faithful. I mean, we are all faithful. So it's an expression that horizontalizes our relationships because of baptism. It recovers the theology of baptism. And I think that's the prophecy today by saying again this word, because it doesn't emphasize the differences, but the equal in our dignity due to the baptism that we all have received. No?
Just a bit of clarification, I think. There are a lot of people who have disengaged from the church, who no longer attend Mass or participate in the sacraments, but would have to be regarded as good Catholic people in the sense of living good Christian lives. Where do they fit in all of this discussion?
Yes, it's I see sometimes this text of Gaudium et Spes in number 11 that has a beautiful contribution to understand this relationship with the world and beyond the Catholic Church as an institution. It says how the Spirit is found in, and we have to find it, it emphasizes like that, in the others, in the world, in the society, and not simply ad intra in the church. So when we say faithful, it implies also the duty of listening to God's voice in the world. Outside, can we say, the institution of the church? Because it's the key principle of the gospel. We have to find God in the other, not in our self-referential way of living a religion or a institutional way of expressing it. So I think that's the challenge. How do we connect our being human with our living our faith and not separating it because of a misunderstanding that it has to do only with an institutional appertenance of the person? So I think Gaudium et Spes is a beautiful document of the council that can help us to move out of this self-referential, institutionalized way of only seeing the church and seeing the church also in relationship to the society and to the world.
Thank you. Ray Temmelman says, I truly appreciate this. I'm not quite sure exactly which he's referring to. Yet I ask the question, given that, for example, in Canada, there are more marriages in which a Catholic marries a Christian of another tradition than there are between two Catholics. And in Australia, fully 35% of marriages involving a Catholic also involves a spouse of another Christian tradition. And given that baptism is the common gift experienced by all these spouses, does synodality include those Christian spouses of other Christian traditions? And if so, how is that to be institutionalized? How is this very large cohort to be taken into consideration if we are to be truly church?
Yes, one of the contributions of synodality is that it recovers the pneumatological side of the church that we have forgotten for so many years, because we have centered the church in a Christo-centric way of understanding it. What I mean by this pneumatological side is that living the Spirit means recognizing the presence of God in each person beyond the institution of the church, beyond even any belief, because the dignity of the person is precisely what we recognize in the other, not if the person belongs to one religion or another. So that's the duty also of each one of us in the church, not to bring the people to the church, but to go in exit, as Pope Francis uses this expression, the church in exit. Is not the church, and sometimes people misunderstand it, it's not the church that goes out to get people to come into the church. It's the church in exit, the church that goes out to the world to have a tent in the world and live with the others independently of their belief, their religion, or their way of thinking, because the church has to recognize the dignity that comes from humanity in each person. So that's the expression is beautiful, exit, but it's not exit, to go out and bring people to the church back again. And this is something that I think we have to learn, and we are learning in the synodal process. And I finish with an example. In the first Latin American and the Caribbean Assembly, Continental Assembly, that was celebrated, a number of people that participated were atheists, agnostic, and people that are not in the Catholic Church. And the theological, precisely, argument is the Spirit is speaking through everybody and not as a self-referential institution with those who are members faithful in the institution. So I think this change is also taking shape in institutions such as the continental assemblies that are arising as we live the synodal process.
Yep, thanks. Francis Donovan asks, being people of God, I sense this sense, in this sense, sounds like a very big full-time responsibility. In practical terms, how can this become possible in our modern world of multiple work, family, and community responsibilities and distractions?
Because people of God is a notion that Lumen Gentium has a beautiful expression that Pope Francis takes in Evangelii Gaudium by saying, people of God in the midst of peoples and cultures. It's beautiful. It's people of God in the midst of other peoples. It recognizes others as people and the others in their own culture. So it's not about, again, this is not a self-referential notion. And that's where we have to break this notion of a church that is only centered in sacraments and a church that has to move forward to be a church in exit, living with the other. To put an example, imagine a parish. If a parish only offers sacraments, that parish is a poor parish because it has nothing more to offer. That means it's not offering humanity, it's not connecting people with the communities, it's not humanizing relationships beyond the four walls of the physical building. In Latin America, not in every place, but mostly, this ecclesiology of the people of God was received in a way that the parishes are not only centered around sacraments, but also social and humanitarian activities. So in the same parish, you have a way of being church in a totality, not simply to go to mass. I think that's something that challenges us in every part of the world. How can we convert parishes in a model that connects the people with the communities where the parish makes life? And I finish with an example. In my diocese in Venezuela, in La Guaira, it was reshape the parish around many communities, local communities with local leaderships and with pastoral councils in each small community. All those communities with their own pastoral councils are linked to the pastoral council of the parish. They're represented there. And in that pastoral council is where they discerned decisions that then go to the pastoral council of the dioceses, and the bishop is linked to the whole process of building a decision. So that's why I think which is the model of parish that we have and which is the model of parish then that we have to build for a synodal church. But it cannot be the same model only centered in sacraments because we are only self-preservating as an institution, but we're not growing as an institution.
The way you describe it, Rafael, the parish pastoral council, the energy for that comes from below. Far too often in Australia, the direction of the pastoral council is very much set by the parish priest, and it's often seen as a something controlled very much by the parish clergy. And Jeff Mulhern asks, what actual method could be used to listen to the whole community and make decisions together?
Yeah, incorporating diversity beyond being Catholic or not in those councils is important because the councils are at the service of the community, not of some in the community, not even only serving the Catholics in the community, it's serving the community. So if we have this image of church in exit, we can have the image of a pastoral council that makes life exiting its own structure. And that means listening to the community problems. There was a bishop in the Dominican Republic, he's now retired. And in one of Celan's meeting, I learned from him that when he first was appointed bishop in his diocese, he found that the communities there didn't have even roads to reach the community. They didn't have water sometimes. So he began a dialogue with the institutions of the government and private institutions, and he integrated in his pastoral plan of the diocese how to humanize the people in those communities. And he was then very famous because he was known as the bishop who built houses, who built roads. And what was he projecting is this church that is at the service of the people in the communities and not simply at the service of a way of understanding the institution of the church. No? So it's a change of mentality in the way in which we change also the understanding of pastoral, because pastoral is also human promotion. Pastoral is preaching Jesus, but Jesus humanized the life of so many people that were not even believers according to the patterns of his time. So, but he recognized that humanity. So I think the gospel and the pastoral way in which we have to engage is one at the service of the other, of the community, and not simply of those that are Catholic in the church.
Peter Snyder says, "Thank you, Rafael, for an insightful and most encouraging presentation, highlighting one of the essential elements of church renewal, synodality. The Australian scene is similar, I'm sure, to many other places around the globe, with an institutional church entrenched in clericalism and operated by a misguided sense of self-importance, misinformed by an ontological view of a supposed change made at ordination. What are we able to do to shift the hearts and minds of those within the church hierarchy who resist the wisdom and spirit of the faithful by not actively listening to their voices?"
Yeah, another experience that shocked me in a positive way of another bishop in Ceylon that I learned was that when he arrived to his diocese, he was first appointed bishop in that diocese, a recently ordained bishop, and he had to assume a diocese that was ultra conservative, that had many problems integrating diversity. And the first year, he asked a theologian woman to teach the Gospel of St. John, a biblical scholar, in the seminary of the diocese. And one seminarian stood up when she was explaining at some point the Eucharist, and this seminarian stood up and said, "You cannot teach me what I'm going to live and do because I am a seminarian, will be a priest, and you are a lay and a woman." What happened? That throughout the processes of interaction and being there, this seminary today changed. But it changed because there was a decision of incorporating diversity in the same process of teaching in seminaries. So if we have this ontological, theological foundation of ordained ministries, we have to change that through a practice of integrating diversity in the formation of the seminaries. What cannot be, at least continue to be done, is that a seminarian live closed in a seminary, and then Saturdays they go 5 or 6 or 7 hours only to a parish, like someone that comes from outside to the parish. No, today there are visions that want to integrate this formation of seminarians with the parish life from the beginning, not only Saturdays or Sundays, because that's where they will do their pastoral life. So it's not a matter of hours. So that's the experience I've had, integrating diversity from the processes of formation and not simply at the end when that priest is already in a parish.
Yeah, thanks. Sergius asks about synodality. Participation by everyone and listening to everyone is important. but participation is also broadly recognized as slowing down decision-making. As a universal church, how can we listen to everyone, 1.2 billion people, without slowing down decision-making in the church?
Yeah, I think that for us all in the Catholic Church, at least, decision making, not only decision taking, but the elaboration of decision together is new. We're used to unilateral decision taking, and only the elaboration is also done by the same one who takes the decision. So if you have a new culture, you need to form that culture, even if it's a minority forming themselves in that culture. So it's like the image of a church. I say always a church in transition. After the Second Vatican Council, many things had to be done from zero, because the council didn't give a ABC guide on how to implement it. So you had Paul VI creating ministries. They had to reform the Curia, they had to reform canon law. There were so many things to do that created many years of transitioning. Right now in the Synod, we are in this same experience. We are a church in transition. We don't have all the answers. And as a transition, we need to work together to create this new institutional model. So I think that sometimes we have to say, we don't have an answer, a response. We have to find it together, because it's difficult in a transition to have already an image built of what will come next. The beauty of this process, at least as I have lived it, is that for the first time in the whole history of the church, not only in the past years, in the whole history of the whole church in every community had the possibility to talk. And in the diocesan reports, what struck me is that people were saying it is the first time that the church asked me something. That's really a call to conversion for us in the church. So I think that's the challenge. We don't have the answers, but we are creating a consciousness that will pressure more and more and more to have a different church where decisions can be elaborated at least by many and not by some, no? But it's a culture to create. This is a difficulty. It's a culture that we need to create. It's not simply a procedure or a method. It's a whole culture. And I insist, and maybe I'm repeating and repeating, but seminaries, if they do not reform, and parishes, if they do not reform, we will be losing a precious time to have in a midterm, at least, and not in a long term, a synodal church.
Thanks, Rafael. You mentioned canon law there. Institutional structures have been determined by canon law. Simon Stevens asks, how can synodality and its communicative dynamics, how are synodality and its communicative dynamics reflected in canon law?
Yes, there are many things that can be already done and not waiting for the synod to end to be done. And sometimes it's a matter of simply not knowing. I remember when the Panamasonan bishop was being celebrated, the discussion of the viri probati, the men who could be ordained, married men who could be ordained as priests for communities, was a big discussion. And during the assembly, the bishops in majority approved, in the final document, they approved the possibility of having viri probati. What happened? Because at the end, the Pope didn't issue a line saying, I approve this. Many bishops then, or all the bishops there, did not do it. And then comes the question. The possibility is already given in the canon law that we have with a correct interpretation of certain canons. And there was a conference that was given to the bishops saying this, how could they do it? What happened is that until now, not one of them that approved the Viri Probati in the synod has done that in their dioceses. So sometimes this is the point, we don't need to wait for an approval when we already have the means to move things, but sometimes the lack of knowledge or a lack of prophecy in the church paralyzes us. So again, the formation. Recently, Pope Francis said, and this is very recently, as we all saw in the news, that bishops were going to do or had to do a course on accountability, for example. Who would imagine that 20 years ago, a pope would say that all the bishops in the world had to do a course on accountability? So I think that it's creating this new culture, but also knowing what can already be done and not simply waiting 2 more years for the Pope to decide, because this is not the model of a Pope deciding and the rest doing. He wants to decentralize, as he says in Evangelii Gaudium, the primacy, and he wants to recover what means to be local church. So that's the challenge, and I think that's where we have to contribute. Like Australia contributed with the plenary council, why not doing plenary councils? In Venezuela, we did a plenary council at the end of the 90s, and Ireland right now is doing a synod. In Buenos Aires, in Argentina, they just did a synod of the Archdiocese of Buenos Aires. So many initiatives doing local processes, and I think we have to go in that direction, do more synod and plenary council in local churches.
Yeah, I love your encouragement for people to take up the responsibility and take the initiative themselves and begin to do things. That feeds in very much the question Christina Rehmer is asking. For many, listening means doing what we are told, like a child must listen to their parents. And we behave as if we are children of God and only do what Father says. When and how do we grow up to take responsibility for our own consciences as per our baptism and act as agents in our communities?
Yes, I was once walking in Puebla, in Mexico. We had an encounter with pastoralists and theologians from all over Latin America and Spain. And I was walking, and there was a church open where they were giving catechesis, and I just entered to see what they were doing. And they were just repeating a prayer, and the children were repeating that prayer, and that's the way they did catechesis and they learned the prayers. So what I was reflecting at that time is, well, the words we use in our prayers already reflect a way in which we relate not only to God, but to the others. So if we do not start by changing our own language and the way in which teach catechesis in parishes, how can those kids become these kids of a synodal church if we teach them just repeating and learning contents? So I think that the need of revising each one of us, the words we use to pray, the words we use to relate to the other in the church, that is the first step to change many things in the church. But we sometimes are hearing and looking at the words of the others, but we don't revise ourselves in the way we speak and we talk to the others and we listen. So I think that's a huge challenge that starts again from the foundations, and we cannot expect a person that has 40, 50 years praying in a way that will change in 2 days, but we can do it right now from the beginning, from the courses where they start people to form their faith. So it's foundational, the synodality. Synodality is something that we have to found today. We have to put the foundations again. This is where we have to look right now. Not sometimes changing what we have, but looking at the foundation so that change will be possible for the next generation. That's the responsibility that we all as an adult have in this moment of the church, changing the foundations.
Yeah, the way that you were expanding on that idea of synodality and extending it as not just as a concept or an idea that we might support, but almost as a way of life and a way of thinking and a way of an attitude towards dealing with all of life, not just church life, but all of that. Elizabeth Young is asking, I wonder about synodal institutional models in terms of episcopal terms. Can we learn from religious orders that have limited terms of leadership? So it's basically, you know, once a bishop, then you're there until you're 75 or longer if the Pope doesn't accept your resignation.
Yes, and I think there is a practice that I didn't know, but just a couple of years ago I found out. In Basel, in Switzerland, they have the possibility of electing, the community elects their bishop. It's not in the 23rd century. It was not in the 1st century. It's right now. So again, we have existing practices that we can see as reference, and we can then today claim for that in the church in any part of the world. So imagine a community that can be a subject in the election of bishop, can also be a subject in the accountability process of that diocese, of that bishop. And I always bring the example of Saint Cyprian, because Saint Cyprian, in the way he incorporated the people in the diocese, was even to say if the bishop that was appointed was accountable or not, and should be removed from the exercise of the episcopacy in the dioceses. This is the tradition of the church. It's not Pope Francis today. This is the tradition of the church in the 1st millennium. So I think even the temporary functions of the bishop was said by De Smet, Monsignor De Smet, during the council. He said, the exercise of episcopacy is temporary because it's at the service of the community. When that service is not a service that reflects the gospel, that bishop is accountable. And the community has the duty, not only the right, the duty to claim accountability in the dioceses. So I think, again, we have possibilities. Sometimes we don't know. Sometimes we are scared because it's the culture in which we were raised, no, of the church. So I think it's a mix of finding out what we have now as a possibility, and at the same time trying to open path. There is no other way. If someone doesn't open the door, no one is going to go out. So someone needs to push the door.
Yeah, your references to the historical precedents there, I think, is extremely important, because so often we presume that what the situation is, what the practices are at present, are the practices that always have been. I was reminded just a few days ago that in 1829, there was something like 660 bishops in the church. And of those, only 70 were appointed directly by the Pope. The rest of them were appointed either by religious groups, by the priests of the diocese, the monarch or king or whoever of particular countries. There were all sorts of arrangements, but only 70 of them got that appointment directly from the Pope. And I also noticed somewhere that back in Ireland in 1844-45, the Bishop of Elphin was actually chosen by the priests of the diocese without reference to any external authority. And that would certainly add to your suggestion that some group is responsible for appointing the bishop and therefore also has responsibility for keeping that bishop accountable. Sounds like revolutionary stuff.
But it's not. It's a tradition of the church, and this is the beauty of all this that is happening. that we have to recover the tradition. It's not a new practice in the church. It's a new practice for us in the church right now. But if we look to the tradition, we would not have so many conflicts interpreting all these things, because the tradition of the church has been rich in all these practices.
Yes. Kevin Wright asks, can we afford the structural change? Celibate priests are a cheap option compared to a married clergy. A synodal church needs to pay its ministers as Protestant churches do, e.g. youth ministers. We can't expect people to work for nothing. But that question of the married clergy goes beyond just the social arrangements and personal arrangements. It also has to do with the economics of running a diocese. What are your reflections on that?
Yes, it's more difficult in some places than others. For example, I know that in Latin America it would be very difficult to support economically a married priest, or even sometimes deacons. They have to work in a daily life work in order to serve in the community because they are not paid. So I think the only way to solve that is to, which is difficult, I mean, to have a view of a global view of many organizations that are helping economically the church, and the church has to have a plan in common and not simply each diocese see what it can do and what it cannot do. An example, in one of the dioceses in Venezuela, there was a cardinal that he never did something for the priest in terms of security insurance and medical insurance. Then came another cardinal, and he said, well, we have to do something, but we don't have the money. And he started to raise the consciousness, not only in the lay people to give money to the church, but in the same priests to find ways together to have that possibility. So it's not waiting here me that someone have money and pay me for something. How do I raise the consciousness to involve those priests and the bishops in the same way that lay people can help? I think it's a difficult problem, but I think also it needs a collective solution. We cannot leave dioceses alone. We have to think in a common plan. Why doesn't a rich country help a poor country, but not simply giving money? Sitting together, organizing visions and plans together, because it's easy to give money. It's not easy to sit together and organize plans together. I think that's a different way of seeing also helping relationships among local churches with more possibilities and less possibilities.
Yeah.
But it's a
Thanks.
difficult question. It's a difficult situation, yes.
Yeah, it certainly is. And money is even in the church, is needed in order to keep the wheels oiled or greased and keep them turning. But we've got to make sure that we keep it in perspective. Trish Heinmarsh has asked a question here. Do you think gender equality in ministry at all levels could be a key factor in overcoming clericalism?
Sorry, can you repeat again?
Sorry.
Yes.
Do you think gender equality in ministry at all levels could be a key factor in overcoming clericalism?
Oh, yes, it is. For example, I've heard homilies 1,000 times much better than a majority of priests. Homilies written and given by women. So I think it changes. Not only, it's not a matter of quotes, as in the society said, it's a matter of dignity, baptismal dignity, equality, and it shapes the relationships in the church. It's not possible that a man that is studying to be a priest relates 90% of his formation life with men. That's something that shapes the way that person will see society and will interact with people. So I think the participation of women at all levels, not only at governance, not only in economic affairs, no, at all levels, information and in parishes is important. One experience that, again, I refer to experiences because what comes to my head from what I've lived, years ago in a parish, the pastor used to write, in a parish that I know, they used to write the homily with the community. And when he read the homily, it was a reflection of the community that had gathered together and written the homily. If that person instead writes the homily as a pastor, as a man, only himself reading other books, it's not the same. So I think that diversity, gender has to be included at all levels in the church if we have to change, if we want to change mentalities. Because again, if 90% of my time are only with men, my view of the world will be different as if I had a regular life every day, interacting and learning from women and men and all the people in society, and not simply with men. And this is something that has to be taken into account. Information.
Yeah. Thanks, Rafael. Anne Benjamin says, in the spirit of Rafael's paper some years ago on this synodalization of the whole church, I have begun to turn my focus on what synodality might mean in local churches. What might it look like in local parishes? Of course, we need to work that through and work it out. And it is a journey of discovery and conversion. However, along the way, Rafael, do you have any pointers in terms of readings or practices that might help progress this agenda?
Yes, in the synod reports, something that comes regularly is the topic of pastoral councils. But for some local churches, this may be something normal that exists. The problem is not if it exists. The problem is if we have thought and even institutionalized ways of working in the pastoral councils, ways of selecting the people in the pastoral councils that are synodal ways. For example, I have seen parishes that do open elections to the community to select the people that will be in the pastoral councils. An initiative for pastor here or there. I also have seen those pastoral councils where just the priest comes and informs. So you see so many different ways. So the challenge is not simply having the pastoral councils, but why does not a diocese implement a procedure on how does a pastoral council should work synodally? For example, taking decisions and building decisions, two things that are different. Why don't we, in the pastoral councils, create a methodology in a way that we can build decisions and the pastor is not the one taking decisions? There is an experience, again, in the synod conversations, that one time a bishop was against one topic, and we were 8, 9 persons, I don't remember, from different life status, lay people, religious, etc. And the bishop said at the beginning, I don't want to talk about this because this is not of the church, etc., etc. When the conversation began, because there was a diversity in the same table, he had to listen. Because the other were talking, or he left or he listened. He had no other option. Through listening, at the end, these were his words, I changed my way of seeing the problem, not my way of accepting the problem. But that's huge, because before he didn't even want to see the problem. So I think that's in a pastoral council, if we do that, it will be a big change. But we need in a diocese to take seriously the way of implementing procedures, methodologies, and not simply saying a pastoral council is obligatory and mandatory.
Yeah, thanks. Do you have any suggestions on how we respond if we live in an archdiocese where there is virtually no encouragement or leadership to be involved in the whole synodal process?
Creating small communities, we don't need the permit of the pastor or the bishop, and this is not a revolutionary thing. It happens in Latin America every time, because faith does not belong to the pastor or the bishop. As I said before, the Spirit does not belong to one person. It's the Spirit through any person that is speaking. So if Ranner, for example, and even Ratzinger after the council, both with different views, they both said that the future of Christianity were the small communities. They both, and they didn't say parishes, which means how can we envision a Christian experience where the domestic community, houses being together, sharing a faith, creating communities, is part of faith. It's not something separately of faith life, no? So sometimes the alternative is not telling the pastor or the bishop, you are not right, you're doing wrongly. Sometimes is, what am I doing to create a new experience of Christian life where I live? And this is a change, because I am empowered by the Spirit to create Christian life in any place where I live. If 2 or 3 of us gather together, says Jesus, I will be among you. So it's not a phrase that we sometimes just say. It's a real experience and a real call that Jesus left us. So let's bet for small communities. Small communities are the foundations of a new Christianity for this time.
Thanks, Rafael. That is extremely encouraging. I've got one last question. Can we include amongst the faithful those who are not formally baptized in the church, but who conscientiously try to live a good life of faith within their knowledge? That is, those who have been alienated from institutional church through clerical abuse, or those who genuinely follow a non-Christian faith. Are not all of us people of God?
Yes, and the key is how any structure in the church has representative of people that are not Catholic, at any person, and not in some parts of the church. I imagine, just to put an example, when Pope Francis wrote like the Laudato Si, he, after writing it, he was in a trip, and when he came back in the famous interviews he offers in the planes, he said that before writing Laudato Si, he convoked so many people, experts on the topic. The majority were not Catholics, and from that conversation was Laudato Si thought. So this is something that is telling me that I am a faithful, a Christi Fidelis in the church. My duty is to work with those independently of being Catholic or not. It's Gaudium et Spes 11. The Spirit is speaking through everybody and not only through the faithfuls in the church. So it's a different thing to say, I am a faithful, I'm a member of the church, I'm a baptized. And another thing is to say, my duty as a baptized and faithful is to be with the other that is not baptized and faithful, to create community, not to bring that person to the church, which is different. Again, church in exit. Living with the other is not bringing the other to my house, is I create a new community between us. And am I able to do this in the structures of the church? Am I able in a pastoral council to include a non-Catholic or a non-believer or any other person there that creates this diversity? That's the challenge. And I think it's already been done, because the Continental Assembly in Latin America and others that we have seen right now have some of them incorporated people that are not Catholic. And that's the reason. It is a duty of the faithful. It's not simply a favor that we're doing to other people. It's our duty.
Thank you very much, Rafael, and your ability to respond to such a range of questions coming from all sorts of different angles is absolutely wonderful, and that it shows or reveals, I think, for us how your vision of church, of life, of the life of the Spirit and life in God is integrated into a single vision with multiple angles and facets in it. So thank you. Back to you, Mario.
Thank you, Rafael. And we're about to close now. So may I call on Andrea Dean of WATAC to conclude this session. I think we could have continued, but there are time constraints.
Thank you, Mario. Thank you, everyone. Rafael, that was just fantastic. So refreshing to hear of this wonderful concept, this wonderful vision of synodality. I think that every now and then there is a gift to us, a kind of a prophetic word, a prophetic vision. And for Australians, I think we have the gift of a prophetic word that came to us from our Indigenous brothers and sisters. And that word was dadidi. It's a concept, a vision of deep listening, of taking a contemplative stance and being transformed, for the Aboriginal people, largely transformed by the land and the environment that we stand in. And while there are some similarities to that very concept and to synodality, I think for me, the big similarity is that synodality is, again, a prophetic word for us, a word that challenges us to deepen our understanding, to be stretched, to be challenged. It really awakens new possibilities for us. It calls something forth in us. So I want to thank you for helping us to understand more deeply this prophetic word, to call us to commit to it and to live it where we are. And I want to thank you too for being a prophet in taking this work, this word, to the people of God all over the world. You've communicated with such clarity and skill, and the little phrases you've left us with are so poetic that that's part of the refreshment and the new vision, I think, that you've equipped us with. So I'd like to thank you very deeply for the wonderful way in which you've spoken to us, and for helping us engage more and more with this vision, this way of being Christian, this way of recapturing the essence of the gospel. So I guess I'd just like to close my words with a little blessing which I've created from your text. So could I ask everybody to raise their hands and to bless each other, and to bless Rafael for his fine work today. So may we be refreshed by the vision of synodality and live and work together with enthusiasm. May we commit to horizontal decentralization and realize the radical equality of the people of God. May we practice communicative dynamics and mediate the Holy Spirit in all that we do. Amen.
Amen.
Well, it's up to me, I think, if I may, just to close the session. Thank you very much for everybody who joined us today. And Garrett Publishing, South Australian Catholics for an Evolving Church, or SACAC, WATAC, the wider ACCCR community, Yarra Theological College, and the University of Divinity. So pleased to be able to provide these sessions to everybody. A great thank you to Rafael. If you liked Rafael's work, please support him by buying his books, which are available at Garrett Publishing. As people who are on webinars often know, there's no such thing as a free webinar. I have to do a plug here or there. Just a couple of things that did come through the comments, if I may. The video will be provided, as will the transcript that Rafael has kindly provided. We will send those out to you during the week. Feel free to share these widely with people in your parishes or in your communities that may not have been able to join us today. We want the word to get out. We want the discussion around synodality. We weren't able to answer all the questions today, but I would like to just say that we'll try to, this is the first of a series of webinars we hope to run this year. We're hoping to run another session in July and one in September. And so if we weren't able to answer your questions through this morning, we will endeavour to make sure that those questions are captured and answered in some way in the future sessions. So Kevin, I think we can probably do that and talk during the week. So with that, I'm going to abruptly close the webinar. Again, thank you very much to everybody, to Trish, to Mario, to Andrea, and of course, Rafael. I tell you what, we've made you work for your supper tonight, Rafael. It was a truly wonderful session. We've done a lot of these events, and this was just outstanding. So thank you so much. Have a very great weekend, and blessings to you all. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are.
Thanks, David.
Cheers. Bye.
Thank you, Rafael.
Thank
Good
you so
night
much.
to you.
Thank you to all. Bye.